Okay, my first recommendation would be to write down the learning outcome. And in a second, when I talk you through the answer, you should take some notes based on the points I give you under that learning outcome. Second thing I would do is write down the practice exam question I have here. And prior to listening any further, I would suggest you try to write an answer to that question using any knowledge you may have, and then listen to the second part of my tutorial where I explore each of the ideas that I have listed up here and how they would help answer this question. So what I suggest you do first of all is pause, write down the question, write down your answer, and then unpause and listen to my points and see whether what you wrote matches. Okay, I'm assuming you've written an answer. So now what I'm going to go through is a series of points that you would be looking to make that relate to these key ideas about why the temperature or the rainfall varies. Now, the answer you may have written, if you've already written an answer, would be an answer which explains temperature variations as shown on this. However, this question could be slightly different and could be focused on rainfall. Let's have a look at temperature. So how does latitude affect the temperature in the UK? Well, we can see that in the south east of England, it's the warmest, and that as you move further north into Scotland, it's the coldest. And this is to do with latitude, which is how far from the equator. Now, to explain that, you need to explain how latitude affects temperature. So the first thing about latitude is at a more northerly latitude, like in Scotland, the angle of the planet is tilted away from the sun, whereas in southern England, they are tilted towards the sun. Now, that angle is important in terms of the area or the surface area of the planet that needs to be heated by the sun. And when you're tilted further away from the sun has to heat more surface area, and therefore that area is going to be cooler, which is the first reason why latitude influences temperature variations. Second reason is that when you are tilted further away from the sun, like northern Scotland, the sun has to travel through a greater amount of atmosphere to get to the surface of the Earth. And as it travels through that greater amount of atmosphere, it is potentially reflected by the gases in the atmosphere. Whereas London, because it's tilted towards the sun travels through slightly less atmosphere, and therefore there's a less of a chance it's going to be reflected by gases in the atmosphere, and therefore more of the sun is going to get to the surface of the Earth. So there's two latitude reasons. Let's have a look at altitude. Altitude is how far above sea level you are. Now, the reason it is much colder in this northern area of Scotland is because there are more mountains. And higher altitudes, mountainous areas, have less gases. So the air gets thinner as you go higher. And the gases in the atmosphere are important in insulating heat or holding on to heat. So as you move further up a mountain, because there is less air up there, there's less ability for the atmosphere to retain heat. Whereas when you're in flatter areas, like in the southeast of England, there's more atmosphere there's more gases, and therefore more of the heat is trapped. The third thing, aspect. Now, this is the direction that something is facing. For example, a mountain slope. If a slope is facing south, it is likely to be warmer because it sees the sun all day long. That's because the sun rises in the east, travels through the south, and sets in the west. A northerly facing aspect or north facing slope will never see the sun because the sun never shines from the north. And that's how aspect can affect temperature. The relief is very similar to the idea of altitude, so we'll just skip that one. Let's have a look at ocean currents. Now, the ocean currents explain why the western side is marginally warmer than the eastern side, because we have the Gulf Stream coming across the Atlantic Ocean where I'm indicating with my arrow. This is a warm ocean current, and this warm ocean current brings with it warm winds. Now, as these strike the western side of our island first, it's likely that the western side will be warmer. Our final factor is urban areas. So how do urban areas affect temperature? Well, cities generate their own pollution. That pollution rises above the city and can trap heat under that pollution blanket, creating a warmer climate under a city. Also, cities create their own heat because they have a lot of buildings generating heat, and therefore a city will also be warmer for that reason. Now, I've given you a whole bunch of reasons why temperatures vary across the UK. What about rainfall? Well, I touched on one to do with the ocean current. This warm ocean current that brings warm air Also, because it's warm, leads to more evaporation. And because that is coming from the west, that increased evaporation forms clouds, and those clouds are most likely to strike the western side of our island first, which is why it's wetter. Mountainous areas are also wetter, and that's because higher land generates its own clouds. Now that's called relief rainfall, and that's where air, when it arrives at a mountainous area, is forced upwards, and as the air moves up, it cools down, and as it cools down, the water in the air condenses to form clouds, and those clouds will give out rain. So that's why mountainous areas are likely to be wetter. Okay, one final general point of this tutorial, and you might want to note this down, is if this question said describe variations in UK average temperature, and you've got to be careful because describe doesn't ask you to give reasons, it just asks you to say what you can see. So for example, the southeast of England has 17-degree temperatures. As you move northwards, the temperature drops to around about 16 around the centre of England and southern Wales. The rest of Wales and northern England averages out around about 15. Most of Scotland is around about 14, with one small exception in the central area, which is 15, and only the very northern tip of Scotland is 14 or 13 at the very top. So you notice I've been giving geographical areas of the United Kingdom and linking them to the data from the map, and that is a typical describe question.